At dusk, there came a turning. There was a moment when all was known. You could feel beauty rising on the breeze, the shapes, the stone, and I would ride.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matthew Riley. I am the bee speaker for this afternoon. I'm a local beekeeper here in South Woodstock, as well as a couple other places around the state, and here to talk about pollinator support primarily. The way we're going to do that is going to start with just a little bit of an introduction to the bees, because I think the best way to support pollinators is to understand what their lives are like and what their struggles are that they face in the world right now. One of the big things that we know, and we've seen lots of news reports about the challenges that bees are facing around the world, and specifically in the US, declining numbers. There was a fair amount of attention paid to it several years ago. That's declined over time as people sort of have either forgotten or moved on from that issue. But for beekeepers, it's a regular part of life that we are all dealing with. And so rather than focus on any kind of doom and gloom, because that's not what I'm here for. I am here to inspire you to help the pollinators, because that's my take on it. The only way we're going to overcome some of the challenges that face our environment right now is through the simple local actions that we each can take to create a better world for the bees, for the butterflies, for the hummingbirds. All these different creatures are what bring us our food. About 30% of everything you eat is pollinated by insects, primarily honeybees. And that's a reality that has a fair amount of weight to it, because in our world right now, they are on the decline. And there's a whole lot of reasons, and without going too deeply into those, the main one being the use of chemical pesticides and herbicides. Again, don't want to delve too deeply into that, but want to give you some ideas about what you can do to work with pollinators in your own small regions of the world, and by doing so, create islands of biodiversity. And that's a concept that I love. By creating these little islands of biodiversity in your own world, by creating some small wild spaces, that is one of the ways that we can support thriving populations. Right now, in the state of Vermont, if you were to ask what the feral bee population is, for state entomologists, they'd probably tell you it's just about zero. In fact, most of the feral bee populations, which once upon a time used to be a fairly common hobby, was called beelining. If you've ever heard the term beeline, would be to catch bees on flowers, and then most of the experienced beekeepers would bring along some kids that were fairly energetic, and you would release the bee, and you would have the kids follow that bee back to the bee tree. And once you found the bee tree, that was your source of honey, and if you could potentially get the hive out of there and put it in a hive box. Well, that's not really a thing you can do anymore, because there really aren't bees in bee trees. If you find them, it's typically swarms that have escaped from commercial beekeeping operations at this, because they just don't overwinter. There's the varroa mite, which is one of the primary destructive forces in the beekeeping world. This is a small mite. It's a terrible parasite. What makes a good parasite? A good parasite keeps its host alive, because it needs the host to survive. The varroa mite will reproduce at a rate where it has, sometimes once a hive is fully infested, you'll see up to 5 or 6 mites per bee. And they weaken the hive down to a place where it can no longer sustain itself. So in the world of beekeeping, there's a bee with a small bee, and there's the bee with the big bee. And to understand this organism is one of the greatest things that's ever happened to me. Now, I'll give you a little bit of my background. As a child, I was stung by a yellow jacket in the temple when I was 8 years old. I was at the town auction in Castleton, and we were running around the cemetery, around the back side of the Federated Church, and I heard a buzzing in my temple, and I just brushed at it, and all of a sudden a dagger of fire penetrated into my head, and I cried, and of course I was inconsolable. But from that day forward, anytime anything flew past my head, I lost it for years. And I'm talking years. I would run around like a madman, trying to escape whatever it was. And it became somewhat debilitating because I do like to go outside and hike and do things in nature. And so about, now it's close to 15 years ago, I said, how am I going to overcome this fear? Well, I think I have to become a beekeeper. So I took a class on it, and I said, okay, I took the class. Interestingly enough, because of the liability issues, there were no actual interactions with the bees. So I took this class, I learned all about bees. I learned about, how to keep hives, I learned their relationship to the environment, what they feed on, what their cycles are, but never actually interacted directly with the bees. And so I said, okay, I still need to get bees to overcome this. And then a couple years later, I finally did. I said, okay, I'm going to take the plunge, and I pulled out my checkbook, and I spent a ton of money on getting myself set up as a beekeeper. And that first year, everything I would do, I had to make sure I was constantly taped up. And there was never a chance that a bee was going to get into my suit. Which, for the first 2 or 3 times I did it, worked. Because I was fairly paranoid about it, and I used a lot of duct tape. But then I started to get a little cocky over time. And I found that bees are really good at climbing up. They don't like to climb down into things. So if you're ever around bees and you tuck your pants into your boots, that's much better than putting it over, because they do like to go up pant legs and apparently shirt tails if those aren't tucked in as well. So after the first few stings, I realized, well, okay, I'm not going to die from this, or at least not if I'm mostly suited up. And then I started to develop a relationship with them, and I started to get more trusting of them. And then I said, okay, I can do this, I can expand. And so I got a few more hives. And what I found was that in the world of the bee, you do a lot of reading as a beekeeper. There are lots of worker bees. Now, I'm not sure how many of you know this, but all the work in the hive is done by the female bees. The males, the drones, do none of the work. Their sole purpose is to eat honey and to go off and reproduce with other queens. And so you have all of these bees in the hive. There are thousands of them. There's a small percentage of them are male. There's one adult female queen that is sexually mature, lays eggs. She will spend the first few weeks of her life off on mating flights. She'll go off on mating flights. She'll mate with usually 8 to 10 drones per flight. And doing so, once they couple, the queen contracts her abdomen, rips off his anatomy, which ends up killing him. He drops to the ground dead. And she does this 8 to 10 times per flight for a few days. And then she returns to the hive, and she'll never leave unless the hive swarms. She'll spend the rest of her life laying eggs. She'll lay up to 1,500 eggs a day during the high season. And she has a small army of attendants that will follow her around the hive. They will feed her, they will clean her, and just make sure that her job of laying eggs is fully realized for the hive. So there's, again, the small bee, those individual bees. Each one of those worker bees has a job in the hive. From the time they first emerge from the cell, they become cleaners, then they become nurse bees, then they'll go into other roles within the hive where they have a period where they'll build up some of the comb. They'll do guard duty, working at the doors to the hive to make sure that other bees or other predators don't come in. And ultimately, at the end of their lives, are the bees that we meet on flowers. These are the foragers who will go off into the environment and find the nectar and pollen, bring that back to make the honey. So all those bees are the small bee, the individuals. The colony itself is the big bee. When I think of a bee, it's the organism itself is the hive. It is a living organism. And when you work with them, you come to realize that this organism is amazing in its scope, in how it reacts, and how it can transmit information via scent. In a hive, a whole lot runs on pheromones, specifically the queen's pheromones. She will distribute information via scent within the hive. And then there's a complex communication that takes place between the bees to locate flowers, nectar sources, and so forth. It's amazing because there's a voice to it. And when you start to get to know that voice, it's one of the most soothing sounds you'll ever hear. When you open a hive and it's a happy hive, you can tell because there's a hum and it's a buzz that is content. It doesn't care that you're there. It's just this bzzz, and it brings joy. Now there's a different sound when you go into a hive that doesn't have a queen. This is a very frightening sound, and rightly so. As a beekeeper, when you open it up, it sounds, let's see, it's a higher pitch, and there's a bit of a discomfort to it, and they will share that discomfort with you. Oftentimes, if you're not fully geared up, you may find you'll get lots of shares of discomfort. And that's one of the key signs for a beekeeper going in to check the overall health and well-being, and it's the happiness of the hive. A happy hive takes less work and it produces more honey, and they like to take care of themselves. So the threats that we see to individual bees, in a bee's world, there's always going to be those threats. There's predation from birds, other insects, wasps, spiders, and so forth. And those are just factors of life. The things that we're looking to overcome as beekeepers are the larger scale threats to the colonies as a whole, because colonies as a whole are pretty good at reproducing themselves. And they'll build up. And we talked about a swarm earlier, that swarms, when you see a swarm, and if you ever do see a swarm, I'm going to leave a stack of cards over here. If you see a swarm, please give me a call when you see it. I will come from far and wide to try to capture that swarm. So a swarm is when the hive decides it's going to reproduce. The hive itself becomes so full with thousands and thousands of bees that it no longer has room to expand. So the existing queen will take half of the hive and lots of resources, leave lots of eggs for the sustaining members of the hive to raise a new queen, and she will leave with half of the hive, and they'll fly up into a tree, typically. That's called bivouacking. And once up into the tree, they send out scout bees, and the scout bees will go all around the surrounding area, typically looking for a hollow tree or an empty hive box. And once enough of those scout bees all agree on the same location, they'll come back and they'll actually start to physically pull the queen in that direction. And it's kind of wild. Now, if you've ever been in a swarm, it's one of the neater experiences, unless you're afraid of bees, which I used to be. But now, I will tell you this: in recent history, I've decided that this process of working through that fear finally came to fruition last year. Now, typically speaking, when I go to capture a swarm, if somebody calls, I will put my suit on and prepare a box, and we'll go and we'll snip the branch and shake the bees into the box, hopefully not getting stung. I happened to be at a bee yard when a hive swarmed, and I was just stopping by to check on a fence. I didn't have my suit with me. It was at the barn. And I said, oh boy, well, there's a swarm. What am I going to do about it? And I was in shorts and a t-shirt. And I said, this is an interesting dilemma, because by the time I get back to the barn and back here with my suit, chances are that swarm's going to be gone. Oh boy. Well, I don't recommend this to anyone, anywhere, ever. But I did have a box, and I did have clippers. And so I encourage the bees by talking to them. I do that on occasion. I find they're excellent communicators. about what their needs are. I asked them to fly as they were swarming in the air down to this little bush that was dead from winter kill, and they were, half of them were thinking about going into the tree, and the other half were thinking about the bush. And then, as I stood there in the center of the swarm, this tornado of bees, they slowly started going down into the bush. I said, oh, good. Oh, now I gotta catch them. And I took the clippers out. I put the clippers between my knees. And I put the clippers at the base of the branch, and I held the branch with my hands very gently. And I snipped the bottom of the branch. And then I had it. 20,000 bees on a stick, in shorts and a t-shirt. Well, they aren't stinging me, so that's really good. But now I have to get these into that box over there. And I said, okay, well, here we go. And I gave it a shake, and in they went. And I had one bee on this end and one bee on this end. And the two of them sat there for about a minute and just licked sweat off of the tops of my thumbs. And I said, okay, you can go down to the box now. And sure enough, that one went down and that one went down. And I very gently closed the box. I said, I think I just got over my fear of bees. Or it was a cry for help of some sort. But either way, it all worked out. I kept the box in, and it's actually been one of the strongest hives I've ever worked with. So these are organisms that the way they act as a whole is tremendous. And it's part of what we're going to be looking to support, is to see the behaviors as what's best for the hive itself, not just for the individual bees, but the way we can act. So that's sort of the global view. On a local point of view, how many here are gardeners? Excellent. And so we have, we all have our philosophies of gardening. I became a gardener when I became a beekeeper. And I realized that the symbiosis of the two was very important. So what I tried to do initially was to do everything right. And then I realized over time that takes an incredible amount of work. And everybody's got a different opinion, because you have to, of course you ask all the experienced gardeners. But now what we've found is that over time, is that those simple practices that are tested and true tend to hold up over time. I use the technique myself personally of no-till gardening, and I do have a broad fork that I use to loosen the soil in the spring. Lay down cardboard with holes in it, and then mulch over top of that once the plants are planted in there. But that is just as far as a methodology for not having to use herbicides on your garden to fight weeds. And I don't know anyone who really enjoys pulling weeds. I've spent plenty of time in my garden pulling weeds, and I have a mantra where it's sit down, pull weeds around bottom, move bottom over, pull more weeds, and I keep working my way through it. But since I found the cardboard version, I found that doesn't really have to happen so much anymore. As far as what you can plant, there are tremendous wildflower mixes available through various of the wildflower distributors in the state of Vermont. I encourage a full season approach to it. So rather than most of our gardens, especially flower gardens, we tend to plant for specific colors and specific spaces. My encouragement to all of you is to create a wild space in your property, preferably more than one. But if you create small islands of wildflowers that bloom throughout the season, starting in May and running through October, that tends to be one of the best ways to do that for the pollinators specifically, because you'll constantly have fresh color, and by having these small areas, bees can avoid their natural predators, as can butterflies, moths, hummingbirds, and so forth, by hopping from spot to spot. You're always giving them cover. Beautiful, large swaths of wildflowers are what we as beekeepers look for for sighting bees, because it's wonderful to have a strong nectar resource, but to have those resources all year long, really helps sustain and support all pollinators. And the idea being, if we create this sort of these islands of biodiversity where you have lots of different species of flowers growing. Now, I'm going to take a side tangent here for a second. If you've ever heard the phrase, your medicine grows in your backyard, for a long, long time, that's where humanity's medicine came from plants, and it came from knowledge of the herbs in your garden. This is in no way, shape, or form a scientific assessment, but my belief is that if you have a wide enough assortment of plants, that the bees will know which plants they can draw from to treat themselves for their various ailments as well, because they've been doing that. They're incredibly adaptable. And they do evolve over time. And we see that as beekeepers from season to season, that there are certain traits that they are self-selecting for. And we as beekeepers try to reinforce those traits by splitting those hives and expanding those genetic traits. For instance, hygienic bees are bees that clean mites off of each other, and that allows for the hive to be stronger. But I sidetracked myself. So to plant small islands of wildflowers and creating those wild spaces is something that I highly encourage everyone to do. Along the margins of wood lines is a great place to do it. If you have running water, along the banks is another great place to utilize that. Or even within your own gardens, if you've got raised beds, to set up small sections of it that are just wildflower dedicated. And if you can do those types of plantings that keep that resource there for the bees and year-round, they will also pollinate the rest of your vegetables and so forth, and they will make you a stop on their daily flights. And it's also how you attract bumblebees. So when you look at the difference between honeybees and bumblebees, a honeybee is a single source pollinator. So on any given day, the scout bees go out in the morning. It's one of my favorite times to sit with coffee and watch them head out. And so they head out and they find the best nectaries. And as they do, they find these nectar sources. They will go out, they'll come back to the hive, and then they share that information with the hive. They do the dance. Oftentimes it's right on the face of the hive if there's enough bees out there. And they'll tell the rest of the hive, well, I found this great source. It's the apple trees are right over there. They're spectacular. There's tons of blossoms. And that's what that hive will go do for that day. The bumblebee, it's a slightly different approach to life. A bumblebee goes up and says, hey, oh, that looks good over there. I'm going to go see that one. Hey, was that some clover? Oh, that looks great. And so the bumblebee will bounce from flower to flower all day long. So they're effective pollinators, but they aren't necessarily the most efficient pollinators for your gardens or your trees. And let's see, what else? So from a pollinator support perspective, if you have a variety of flowers, one of the best sources for that, if you want to see what native species are specific to your location, the Xerces Society. I don't know if anyone has heard of it. Is Xerces, and I believe it's xerces.org. Xerces, and they the name was drawn from the first butterfly that is believed to have gone extinct because of direct human actions. It was the Xerces butterfly. They have an incredible resource of plants for your zone that are native and non-invasive. And so to be able to plant not just, I absolutely support people planting clover in their gardens, or in their yard, but the low-growing clovers, and to let it go. There's another one. We're just about on that time of year when the dandelions come up. And this is oftentimes, I find that I saw that reaction right there. So we've been conditioned to think that seeing dandelions in a yard is a sign of poor land stewardship because we've let our dandelions come up. Dandelions are typically the first major pollen source besides tree pollens that a bee will have in the spring when they're building up strength of the hive. As much as possible, I would encourage everyone to at least let the flush of dandelions, once they start to close, you don't have to let them go to seed head. I completely understand that, but to leave them there for all of the pollinators and any insects that actually need pollen to survive. That's the first food in the spring.
At dusk, there came a turning. There was a moment when all was known. You could feel beauty rising on the breeze that shapes the stone, and I would ride upon the breeze that shapes the stone across the sky.